we will start.
Okay, well, I will see if I can share my screen.
Oh, so maybe I'll just introduce you for those online. So today we're with Professor Abigail Green from Oxford University, who is going to speak about the life of Sir Moses and Lady Judith Montefiore, which is really a fascinating subject because, you know, Sir Moses Montefiore was born in Leghorn, Livorno in Italy, and was really, I guess, the first Sephardic philanthropist. Just one thing I'll mention is not many people, you know, in most towns you go, you know, I grew up and I was constantly going through Montefiore Road in Hove. There's not a town, I think, that you can go to in the United Kingdom which does not have a Montefiore Road in it. And in fact, although Sir Moses never made it to New York, the cemetery which the Lubavitcher Rebbe is buried in is named after Sir Moses. So, Professor Green, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's exciting to speak to a Sephardic community in Vancouver. It would be obviously more exciting actually to be in Vancouver, but I'll just have to put that on my wish list. So you'll see I've given this talk a slightly different title, Sir Moses and Lady Judith Montefiore, Between Tradition and Modernity. And this is a title I was given actually when I spoke to the Montefiore Festival in Jerusalem a couple of years ago. But I thought it was actually rather appropriate for this audience because, well, and in thinking this, I take my cue from Rabbi Abraham Levy, who is the former spiritual leader of the London Spanish and Portuguese congregation, so the home Sephardic community in Britain. And Rabbi Levy is very engaged and committed with perpetuating what he calls the Montefiore ethos. And I think this actually reflects his understanding of Sephardut as a kind of middle way between tradition and modernity, and perhaps better able to navigate that than some other traditions within Judaism. So let's see how far that understanding can be applied to Sir Moses and Lady Judith. And what I'm going to do in this talk is to think about them as individuals, who they were, what they cared about, how their lives reflected the cultures into which they were born, the society that shaped them, and the changing times in which they lived. And I want to begin by commenting briefly on this portrait of the Montefiores as a young couple. So we think it was taken shortly before their wedding. It's the only portrait of its kind I'm familiar with, and probably a good starting point for thinking about them as people, because what we don't see here is the well-known iconic figure that Sir Moses became in later life, nor the gentle and saint-like model of Jewish womanhood who was eulogized in Judith's obituaries, but rather we see this young, Regency, very European-looking couple embarking a little awkwardly on married life in late Georgian London. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at them both separately, and then I'm going to think about how we might consider their lives in terms of the tension between tradition and modernity that did characterize the European 19th century, and also the interplay between Jewishness and Englishness in an age of acculturation and nationalism. So what do we know about Sir Moses? On this slide, we have some key dates. He was indeed born in Livorno, which was in many ways the most important port in the Sephardic Atlantic world. He was born in 1784, 5 years before the French Revolution, very much a product of the cosmopolitan Western Sephardic diaspora, but also someone with deep roots in the Anglo-Jewish business elite. His mother was a Dematas Makata, and the Makatas were one of the first families readmitted to Britain under Cromwell. So on his mother's side, he went right the way back there, but through his father's side, he came rather differently. You'll probably know in this audience that the Western Sephardi diaspora was forged when Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal, and the shape of this diaspora reflected the rise of world maritime empires: Venetian, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French. As members of a scattered but culturally close-knit community, Sephardic Jews created highly specialized trading networks, supported by ties of religion and family which cut across empires and oceans. And the Montefiores were a typical product of this history. Fearing for their lives in Cordoba, their ancestors, the Carvajals, had converted to Christianity, but continued to live secretly as Jews and left Spain soon afterwards, for Portugal to escape the Inquisition, and later for Mexico, where Luis Carvajal rose to become a provincial governor, but the Inquisition eventually caught up with him. He and his son died in prison. His daughter was burned at the stake, but it appears that his grandson escaped to central Italy, where he took the name Montefiore. And the descendants of this Montefiore eventually settled in the port of Livorno, which was really a mecca, as you may know, for Sephardic Jews, because in Livorno they were protected from the Inquisition. It was a condition of the Statute of Livorno that you couldn't be persecuted for having converted and then returned to Judaism. As trade in Britain grew in importance for Livorno, so some of the Jewish trading families there began to establish branches in London. And it was this which brought Montefiore's grandfather, Moses Vita, to London. But in fact, he retained close family ties with Livorno. There were marriages between the two branches, which was a kind of common practice. And Montefiore's father, Joseph, traded on these connections. He had a successful business trading Livorno bonnets, which was a kind of straw hat, which was hugely fashionable in the late 1780s, but a business which then collapsed with the French Revolution and the upheavals of the 1790s. Still, in 1784, Sir Moses was actually born, as Richard has said, in Livorno on one of his father's business trips to Italy, and consequently he was brought up to nurture ties with his Italian great-uncle Moses Racca, so the Raccas were a Moroccan family, and with other members of his cosmopolitan Sephardic family network who established bases in the West Indies, North America, and eventually Australia. Meanwhile, as I said, his mother, who was born Rachel Lombroso de Matos Macata, descended from one of the first Jewish families readmitted to England, and the connections he had as a result of his mother's family meant that he was also well embedded in the more settled world of the City of London's financial and business elite. This, by the 1790s and early 1800s, the Western Sephardic diaspora was in fact in decline, and so I think it's not surprising that the young Moses followed his mother's family as he sought his way in the world. And here we can see some further key dates from his life. He married Judith Barrett Cohen, who was the sister-in-law of Nathan Rothschild in 1812, and you may imagine that this was a very useful contact for a man who was trying to make his way in the City of London, and Montefiore and Nathan Rothschild worked closely for several years together. By 1819, Montefiore had made a fortune on the stock exchange. He was a stockbroker, really, and in the 1820s he founded a string of spectacularly successful businesses, such as the Alliance Assurance, the Provincial Bank of Ireland, and Imperial Continental Gas. But he'd always had a religious streak, and in 1827 he and Judith set off for a life-changing trip to Palestine. Now, this wasn't as unusual as it sounds in the Sephardic world. You may know, in fact, that boatloads of Jewish tourists left Livorno for Jaffa on an annual basis in the early 19th century, and it was very common for people to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land from within the Ottoman world as well. But I think for a businessman in the City of London, it was an unusual step. And here on this map, you can see, get a sense really of what that kind of journey might have meant in 1827. And it's not just that there were no railways or steamships. There was, in fact, a significant war going on in the Eastern Mediterranean due to the Greek War of Independence. So it was a highly dangerous time, and this was quite difficult for the Montefiores as they travelled. And the world they came from was very different to the world they visited. So on the left, we have a picture of Cheapside in the late 1820s, the life with which they were familiar. And on the right, we can see an image of Jerusalem in the 1830s by David Roberts. This was, as you may imagine, a life-changing experience, and it was the moment Sir Moses became a pious man, and in a more properly observant way, he decided he would live as an observant Jew, devoting his life to performing mitzvot. In the 1830s, after he returned to England from this pilgrimage, he devoted himself to Anglo-Jewish politics and the campaign for Jewish emancipation. In 1835, he became president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And this was also the period when he bought a country house, Eastcliff Lodge, and built a synagogue there, quite small but rather beautiful, and supposedly allowed Princess Victoria, not yet Queen Victoria, to enjoy his gardens when she visited Ramsgate in 1835. In 1837, Sir Moses served as Sheriff of the City of London, which was a substantial judicial role and a kind of stepping stone in the campaign for Jewish emancipation. He was only the second sheriff, and Jews at that time were hoping to gain admission to Parliament as well. And it was a role which involved a lot of pomp and circumstance. So famously, he used to take kosher chicken with him to city dinners, and he refused to attend dinners if they clashed with Shabbat or religious festivals. And in 1837, he was knighted by the young Queen Victoria when she acceded to the throne. But despite this commitment to the campaign for Jewish emancipation in Britain, Montefiore had not forgotten the poor of Jerusalem, and he played an increasingly important role in fundraising efforts on their behalf. And I don't know whether you know this, but in fact, fundraising on behalf of the poor of Jerusalem and the other holy cities in the Holy Land, so Sfat, Tiberia, and, oh, now my mind's gone blank, and Hebron, was a well-established practice in the early modern world. People would be sent from Palestine to raise money for these communities. They went as far as India and New York already in the 18th century, and Sir Moses, as he now was, became active in helping to channel money to Palestine. In 1839, in this capacity, he set out on his second trip to Jerusalem, this time bringing money with him to help survivors from a terrible earthquake in the Galil, which destroyed the ancient walls of Tiberias. You've probably, if you've been to Tiberia, you will have noticed that the walls are in ruins. That's as a result of the earthquake in the 1830s. And it sent the holy city of Sfat tumbling to the ground. During this visit, he also made contact with all the leading figures in the growing Jewish communities in Palestine and took it upon himself to raise money for them in the diaspora. And he entered into detailed conversations about the possibility of renting agricultural land on a large scale, the profits from which might render these communities sustainable and encourage the persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe to make their home there. So far advanced were his plans that he returned via Alexandria in the hope of persuading Mehmet Ali, who was then Pasha of Syria as well as Egypt, to endorse his plans for agricultural settlement. And it's for this reason, really, that Montefiore is seen as a pioneering Zionist avant la lettre, because he saw Palestine already in the 1830s as a potential refuge for Jews from Eastern Europe. And it's also at this moment, 1839 to 40, that Montefiore begins to emerge as an international Jewish leader. This process was cemented by the Damascus affair of 1840, which was a seminal moment in the history of the 19th century Jewish world. Montefiore famously travelled to Alexandria with his French Jewish counterpart, the lawyer Adolphe Crémieux, another Sephardic Jewish leader, in fact, and obtained the release of prominent members of the Damascus Jewish community who had been accused of ritual murder, in other words, of using the blood of murdered Christians to bake matzot. The blood libel was a medieval calumny, but it mattered to Montefiore and Crémieux in a very real way. First, because, in fact, it had been made by French Catholics in Damascus, particularly the French consul. And second, because if rather non-Jews in Europe believed in the blood libel and that Jews in Damascus had been engaged in ritual murder, it was something which could stop the process of Jewish emancipation in its tracks. And so with one eye to Europe, Sir Moses travelled on from Alexandria to Constantinople, where he met with the young Ottoman Sultan and obtained an impressive-sounding document that condemned the blood libel as a lie and appeared to offer equal rights to Ottoman Jews. Really, I mean, now as historians we understand that this firman, this Ottoman decree, essentially confirmed the protections already offered to Jews and Christians by Sharia law as peoples of the book. But the way, particularly the way in which it was translated, meant that it was read very differently in Britain. And in fact, that status was in some ways better than the status of Jews in pre-emancipated Jews in European countries. So taken together, these two initiatives, the Project for Agricultural Colonization in Palestine and the mission to Damascus, would, I think, come to define Sir Moses' career as a Jewish leader in later life. The key elements are all here already: love for the land of Israel, a place at the heart of diaspora fundraising for the Jews of Palestine and elsewhere, and a diplomatic role which entailed foreign missions and high-profile meetings with rulers and their ministers. And here I've put together a kind of slide which speaks to these three facets of Jewish leadership and how they were manifested in Sir Moses' life, because I think we can see them as three threads, really, which ran through it. So the first of these threads, Palestine, Eretz Israel, saw Montefiore return 5 more times to Jerusalem, and you can see the dates there. The last of these journeys in 1855, when he was 90. Each of these visits was connected with efforts to revitalize the Jewish communities in Palestine and render them more productive through agricultural colonization, through proto-industrial activities such as weaving, through building the famous windmill and pioneering Jewish housing outside the walls of the Old City, which I will talk about a bit later, and through sponsoring a slightly more modern approach to Jewish education, which I'll also talk about a bit later. The second of these threads saw Sir Moses emerge really as a linchpin of international fundraising on behalf of beleaguered Jewish communities and those in need of emergency aid. And this began with his attempts to raise money for survivors of the Great Fire of Smyrna. But we could also talk about his intervention on behalf of Jewish refugees from the sack of Mogador, the north coast of Africa, Morocco, his efforts to raise money very successfully for Jewish famine victims in Palestine, particularly in 1855 during the Crimean War. Here we can see an image of the recipients of the targets of another campaign, Jewish refugees from the Spanish-Moroccan War of 1860. And he also raised a lot of money for Jewish famine victims in Persia in 1872, when a famine wiped out about a third of the population. And unusually, and I think this is important, he also took the lead in raising money on behalf of the Syrian Christians after the massacres of the early 1860s in Syria and Lebanon. And I think these initiatives were related to one another. So his thing, he used to appeal also to the Christian world to support Jews in distress. And the obverse of this was then appealing to Jews as well as Christians to support Christians in distress. So on the one hand, he continued to act as a conduit for the traditional flow of money from the diaspora to Jewish communities in Palestine, which is called Chalukah. But he also responded to other kinds of disaster and pioneered new approaches, using a kind of language of humanitarian sympathy to raise money from Gentiles, particularly in Britain, North America and Australia, so the Anglosphere, and making brilliant opportunities of the mass press, which you can see here through the Illustrated London News image. And the final aspect of Sir Moses' Jewish leadership was really diplomacy. So he embarked after 1840, the Damascus affair. There was a series of high-profile diplomatic missions on behalf of Jews in other parts of the Jewish world, and in a way it revitalized the established tradition of Stadlanut, or intercession, by wealthy, well-connected Jewish notables on behalf of their less privileged and more vulnerable brethren. And we can see here some of the images of Sir Moses' diplomacy as they were reproduced in the Illustrated London News to mark his 100th birthday on the left, and in an account of his trip to Morocco on the right. And this is a painting by his friend, the Quaker Thomas Hodgkin. So in 1846, he travelled to Russia, where he met Tsar Nicholas I, toured the Pale of Settlement and the Kingdom of Poland, in response to Nicholas's active programme of Russification, which seemed to be an attack on traditional Jewish life. In 1855, he stopped in Constantinople on the way to Jerusalem, where again he met with the Sultan to obtain authorization for his charitable initiatives, in particularly Mishkanot Sha'ananim. In 1859, he travelled to Rome and met with the Pope's Secretary of State, Cardinal Antonelli, in an effort to obtain the return of Edgardo Mortara, a Jewish child who'd been secretly baptized and taken from his family by the church authorities so he could be brought up as a good Catholic. And this was a feature of Jewish life in pre-emancipation Italy, in fact, forced baptism. In 1864, he travelled to Marrakesh, which we can see here, where he met with the Sultan of Morocco and obtained a document quite similar to that granted by the Ottoman Sultan in 1840. And in 1867, he went to Bucharest in Romania, where he met Prince Carol, the new king, in a futile attempt to stop the pogroms, which were a feature of Jewish life in 1860s, 1870s Romania, and legislation which was designed to expel Jews from the countryside and limit their economic activities. And finally, in 1872, he travelled again to St. Petersburg, this time meeting Tsar Alexander II, once more advocating the cause of Russian Jewry. And if you look at the images from the Illustrated London News, you can see him shaking hands with one of the Tsars, I think Nicholas I, and sitting talking to Mehmet Ali of Egypt. This was obviously an extraordinary career. And it's worth noting that Sir Moses was well over 50 when he set out on the first of his famous diplomatic missions, that's in 1840, and nearly 90 when he returned from the last. His flair for publicity and the international nature of his activities established a global reputation, certainly in the Jewish world, and Richard has spoken to that, but also among non-Jews who celebrated Montefiore not as a parochial Jewish figure, but as a great humanitarian. And here, I think, it's worth taking a moment to consider how Sir Moses himself appeared at the various points in his public career and how the different facets of his career were reflected in the image he projected. So we can see that as a young man, he looks quite the Regency buck in his tailcoat and top hat with those dashing sideburns and high collar. In fact, he wore it all his days. You can see the same high collar in the picture of him as an old man. Then we have an image of him holding the firman he received from the Ottoman Sultan in 1846 in his uniform as a sheriff of the City of London. So whenever he travelled and met people, he always put this uniform on, because court society was very much about wearing uniforms. And finally, we have an image of him in old age. And I would draw attention to this, it's a kind of kippah he's wearing, really, which I think speaks to the fact that he became more religious in old age. So you never see pictures of him wearing that when he was younger, but all the images of him in later life do show him with his black hat. I'm now going to move on to talk about Sir Moses' wife Judith and consider how she fits into this broader picture and how thinking about her helps us to understand his life and work differently. So what did she bring to the Montefiore project? So Judith was born in 1784. She was the daughter of Levi Baron Cohen, who was a wealthy Ashkenazi businessman of Dutch origin. So she came from a different branch of Jewish diaspora. She was not Sephardic. Although, of course, Holland was one of the few places in Europe, and particularly Amsterdam, where Ashkenazi and Sephardic cultures really did coexist side by side. Now, Judith was well educated in a conventional Western sense, but had enough Hebrew to follow the service and read the weekly Torah portion. So she had obviously had some kind of Jewish education. And here we can see a picture of her father, So we can see he didn't present himself in a particularly observant way, but we know, for example, that he corresponded with a rabbi about whether it was acceptable in Jewish law to carry an umbrella on Shabbat. So I think, despite his English dress, it's clear that she was brought up in a properly Jewish family environment. Now, an important thing is, in fact, that Sir Moses came from a Sephardic family and Judith was Ashkenazi. They were relatively unusual in 1812 in marrying across the Sephardic-Ashkenazi divide in England, and they clearly saw themselves as a cross-cultural couple. So Judith learnt Italian, and he used to refer to her jokingly as his liebe Frau, his dear wife, picking fun at her German origins. And I think the desire to cross this divide between the Sephardim and Ashkenazim was actually a central feature of Sir Moses' philanthropic agenda in later life. And we can see it in two different places. So on the left, we have Mishkanot Sha'ananim, which is the housing estate which Sir Moses established outside the walls of the holy city of Jerusalem. And you may know that this was in fact the first Jewish settlement outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, and in this sense a very important step in the evolution of the Jewish community in Eretz Israel. So that's Mishkanot Shananim. On the right-hand side, we have the Lady Judith Montefiore College, which was a rabbinical kollel established by Sir Moses in Ramsgate after his wife's death. And the important point I want to make is that in both places, what Sir Moses wanted to do was to found communities of observant Jews, which included equal numbers of Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And in fact, both these communities were characterized by a kind of rows of little houses in which these different families would live. But the idea was that there would be equal numbers of both. And in fact, in this, his success was mixed. He was never, I think he was successful in Mishkanot Shananim, but he always struggled to achieve it in Ramsgate. Now, in my biography of Sir Moses, I talk about his pioneering role as an international Jewish activist and in the globalization of Jewish consciousness. And I think his ability to bridge the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide and his willingness to do so is a key dimension of this. And that's obviously something which comes from his marriage. So that's one thing which Judith brought to him. But I also think she brought more concrete assets, which were really the foundation of his career. So here we can see Judith's brother-in-law, Nathan Rothschild, and her sister, Hannah Rothschild. And it was through her sister, Hannah, and the connection with Nathan Rothschild that we can best explain Sir Moses' meteoric rise into huge financial wealth. So it was less spectacular, obviously, than Nathan's, but nevertheless very important. And Nathan's sister, Henrietta, went on to marry Sir Moses' brother Abraham, with whom he was in business at the time. So this was a further family connection between the two families. Now, obviously, you didn't have to be extremely wealthy to be an international Jewish leader in the mid-19th century, but honestly, it helped. So we can think of examples of people who weren't, like Adolphe Crémieux, the lawyer and politician who accompanied Sir Moses to Alexandria, or Ludwig Philippson, the rabbi and journalist, who was editor of the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums. So they were both very important figures who were not so wealthy. But I think there is evidence to suggest that the particular kind of activities Sir Moses engaged with, and things like his access to the sultans of Turkey and Morocco, reflected the fact that in Turkey and Morocco, people knew he was Nathan Rothschild's brother-in-law, and they assumed that he was operating to some extent as Nathan Rothschild's or the Rothschilds' agent, also in financial affairs. So they thought there would be a benefit to their governance from doing business with him and being receptive to his diplomacy. So I think in this sense too, the Rothschild relationship, which Judith herself did much to foster, was critical to Sir Moses' future influence. In the more global world of the 19th century, it represented an internationalization of the nexus between finance and influence, which had always underpinned the traditional practice of Stadlanut, or intercession. Now, Judith and Montefiore were childless, probably because Judith was infertile. And there can be no doubt that this was a personal tragedy. And here we can see, in fact, a fertility amulet, which was given to Judith when she visited Kever Rachel, the tomb of Rachel, in 1827 on their first visit to Jerusalem. And some of you may know that Kever Rachel is actually a site of fertility pilgrimage, and Judith was one of the first people to do this. So we can see this was something which mattered very much to them, as one might understand. And I think their childlessness was actually a further fundamental force which drove their philanthropy and public activity, creating a void at the heart of their married life, which they sought to fill in other ways. If the Montefiore's had had children, Sir Moses might have seen greater purpose in his business activity, turning his efforts to founding a dynasty after his fortune was made. If Judith had had children, certainly her attentions would have been diverted elsewhere, and she would have had neither the time nor the inclination to accompany her husband on his various expeditions or to forge a role for herself as a player in the world of international Jewish activism in her own right, because, in fact, she did. So here I think we come to the heart of Judith's contribution to Sir Moses' life and work as an international Jewish activist. So first of all, she was his travelling companion. She accompanied him on the mission to Damascus in 1840, to Russia in 1846, to Rome in 1859, and on 5 of his 7 trips to Palestine. And when we consider that in 1827 she was one of only 6 Western European women to visit Palestine in over 100 years, we can see how unusual this kind of travelling was for a woman like Judith. Now, these were very gendered worlds, as you can see, I think, from these images of their trips to Eretz Israel. And Judith's presence added an important dimension to the Montefiore's interaction with the people and societies he encountered en route. So very often she was the only woman present. And at the same time, she was able to enter into female spaces which were closed to him. So we find her observing the High Holy Days in the Ladies' Gallery of the private Fua Synagogue in Alexandria, visiting Kever Rachel, as I said, accompanied by a group of Jewish women in 1827, when Sir Moses was touring male study houses in Jerusalem, and socializing with the ladies of the Egyptian royal household when she visited the harem in Alexandria, and indeed inspiring a group of Warsaw widows to found a female philanthropic association during her visit there. And this is an image of a testimonial which these women produced, which belongs to the Montefiore Endowment and helps us to understand, I think, how she functioned as a role model for women in leadership positions in other parts of the Jewish world. So these Warsaw widows say, in a gathering, we all agree today to declare the pious lady Baroness Yehudit Montefiore the head of our association. May she serve as the leading example in it and among us and in all the good deeds for our poor sisters in Israel here. And may her mercifulness be an example before our eyes. And may from today all our actions take place in her name. So she's very much a role model as well. And I think that's quite significant. Now, another thing which Judith did for Sir Moses was to act as his publicist. So perhaps you are, though I would be surprised, familiar with her cookbook, The Jewish Manual, which was in fact the first Jewish cookbook published in English. And it's really a kind of feminine take on the difficulties of combining English-style gentility with religious observance, which Sir Moses resolved so successfully. So he was concerned to take his kosher chicken with him to city dinners and to have them rescheduled if they clashed with Jewish religious holidays. But Judith wanted to demonstrate that you could make an elegant meat sauce without butter, although having eaten actually several meals now inspired by this cookbook, I'm not sure that she succeeded in making one which we would recognize as particularly tasty today. I think Judith's literary contribution to Sir Moses' agenda was more significant than this suggests, however. So the Jewish Manual, it's a very feminine thing to do. but female travel writers were very rare at this point in the world of Western European letters, and yet Judith privately published accounts of both her first and second trips to Palestine. So as a Jewish woman writer, travel writer in the early 1830s and 1840s, she was unique within the Jewish world. And her travel diaries demonstrate genuine literary aspiration, but they were also taken seriously by the broader Jewish public. In fact, her 1839 travel diary was clearly intended as an intervention in public debates about how best to support the Jewish community in Palestine. So she published it in 1844, together with translations of letters to Sir Moses from local Jewish leaders who were apparently sympathetic to his plans for agricultural colonization. Excerpts from Judith's book were then published in French in the Univers Israélite, which was the more orthodox of the French Jewish newspapers, and it even attracted the attention of the future founder of religious Zionism, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who wrote to Sir Moses asking for a copy of Judith's book. After her death, it was reprinted in Hebrew translation by Louis Levy, who was the secretary of Sir Moses, and it served as a major reference point in debates about how best to support Jews in Palestine in the 1870s. So this is not just travel writing, it's a really active intervention in debates taking place throughout the Jewish world about how best to support Jews in Palestine. But I also want to point out that Judith was as well a player in the world of international philanthropy herself. So in Warsaw, we've seen that she acted as an inspiration to others. And if you looked or listened carefully to the testimonial that she received, you'll see that they appointed her as the treasurer of their community, obviously in the hope that she would give them money and act as a kind of mediator. In Britain, we find Judith not just active in communal and local charities, but sitting on the board of international British charities alongside figures like Florence Nightingale, the famous Crimean nurse, the Countess of Shaftesbury, whose husband was a leading Christian Zionist, and Lady Stratford de Redcliffe, who was a wife of the former ambassador to Constantinople. And in Palestine, she was really regarded as an almost equal partner in her husband's endeavours, and empowered, as in Warsaw, to act as gabayit, or fundraiser, by communal charities in her own right, partly because she was obviously generous herself, and partly because she represented to these communities a new source of charity through her connections with the wealthy Jewish women of the West. And you can see that in some of the things that they write to her. But I think it's not just that she is someone to whom Jews in Palestine and Warsaw are appealing for money. Her concerns also helped to shape Sir Moses' charitable agenda. It was Judith, in fact, who proposed refurbishing the decrepit tomb of Rachel, Kever Rachel, on which her own tomb in Ramsgate is modelled. And it was Judith who instigated Sir Moses' most controversial initiative in Palestine, which was to create a girls' school teaching Hebrew and sewing in 1855. And in fact, it does seem that he was subjected to a herem by some sections of the Jerusalem community for this promotion of female education. Here too, it's worth taking a moment to consider how Judith appeared at different moments in her life. And I think the contrast with Sir Moses is quite instructive, because we could see that his image changed really quite dramatically over the years. But I think this is much less true of Judith. So she's a little older and a little less décolleté in the second of these images. But there are no clues really to suggest that she became more religious, more traditional, or less worldly with age. Unlike her husband, there's no female equivalent of the little black hat. So what should be apparent by this point, both from what I've said and from the images you've seen, is that the Montefiores moved between different worlds. Some of these worlds were traditional. I'm thinking of Jerusalem, Sfat, Vilna, Warsaw, and some were more modern, because of course Britain actually epitomized modernity in the early to mid 19th century. As the 19th century wore on, the concept of progress became increasingly loaded. As a Jew and an Englishman, Sir Moses would have identified with it. As a Jew, because he saw Jewish emancipation as a hallmark of progress and civilization, and as an Englishman, because he saw the British Empire as the standard bearer of civilization and humanity. He was also an enthusiast for modern technology, a pioneer of gas lighting in the metropolises of Europe, eager in old age to attend synagogue services in Ramsgate virtually by a kind of telephone. And no one who was as well-travelled as he could fail to appreciate the ways in which modern technology, railways, steamships, the telegraph, bound the world together in new ways. So he was a man who embraced modernity, both in terms of technological innovation and as a value system which conveyed Western ideals of civilization and humanity. And if I were asked to think really about the transformative nature of his impact on the Jewish world, that's what I would focus on, the way he embraced this discourse of civilization and humanity and understood that it provided a kind of way of universalizing concern for Jewish distress, and the way he seized the opportunities provided by new communication technologies to bind the Jewish world together in new ways. But embracing modernity didn't make him less Jewish or more English. And this brings me to Ramsgate, where the Montefiore's manifested their Jewishness in ways that really were very English. So having purchased a country seat, this charming Gothic villa, the Montefiore's proceeded to build, and there you can see the interior, the Gothic library, the Montefiore's proceeded to build a small private synagogue here, which we can see here, so that Sir Moses could observe his religion when in the country, just as a Christian gentleman might worship in his private chapel or local parish church. And when Judith gave her wedding dress to make a Torah mantle, she underlined, I think, the extent to which this was a joint project and the place of Jewish practice at the heart of their married life. And it was this which made Eastcliff Lodge so unique. But I want to say that though Sir Moses was by no means the only Jew to buy a grand country pile and live the life of an English gentleman, the Jewishness of Eastcliff Lodge and Ramsgate was very different from that of most of the other country houses that belonged to people like Nathan Rothschild. Indeed, arguably living an observant Jewish life in a rural English quay was not incidental to the Montefiore ethos, but fundamental to it. Many rich Jews had country houses, and some of these houses had private prayer rooms, but this freestanding synagogue in its rural English setting is unique to my knowledge in both England and indeed Europe. And it was here that Sir Moses eventually chose to establish the Judith College in his wife's memory, an idiosyncratic institute of higher learning which took the traditional rabbinical kollel and fused it with the British tradition of university education modelled on the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, that was simultaneously places of residence, places of learning, and places of worship. And here we can see a great historic image of the synagogue, the little tomb modelled on Kever Rachel, and the college in the distance. And you can see this was a pretty rural environment. The key point, I think, is that the Montefiore's ceaseless travels and extensive exposures to less anglicised forms of Jewish spirituality broadened their horizons and reinforced their commitment to more traditional and less acculturated forms of religious practice, but without making them less British. So we find Judith apparently making a fertility pilgrimage to Kever Rachel as early as 1827, and in 1846, when the couple visited Vilna, they reportedly spent hours praying and weeping at the tomb of the Vilna Gaon. Nowadays, the position of women in Judaism is one of the key dividing lines between traditional and reform religious practice, but when Judith went with Sir Moses to Palestine in 1839, her experiences transcended those normally reserved for women. She was repeatedly led to a place of honour in the synagogue and allowed to participate in the Torah service, although by lighting the lamps in front of the ark or dressing and undressing the Torah scroll rather than anything more vocal. For instance, during her visit to Sfat in 1839, and here we can see what it looked like in the aftermath of the earthquake, when she went, and if you've been to Sfat, you'll know the synagogues there are absolutely tiny, and I think it's important to bear that in mind as we think about this. She was given a seat opposite the ark and played an important role in the inauguration of a particularly venerated Sefer Torah. So when the Hasidic leader, Rabbi Abraham Dov, carried this Sefer Torah through the streets of Sfat in its ruined state at the head of a procession of Hasidim singing, dancing and clapping their hands, Judith was taking her place underneath the chuppah over the Sefer Torah bearing a lighted tafer. And the point I really want to make is twofold. So on the one hand, she does appear to have encountered greater latitude about what was and wasn't possible for her as a woman in Sfat than she did back home in England. So this kind of thing wouldn't have been possible in England, but it was actually possible in Sfat in the 1830s. But on the other hand, I think her response is also unexpected. So Western European Jews tended to denigrate and sneer at the charismatic religious style of the Hasidim, and Judith actually was attuned to evangelical religious sensibilities as a British woman. She was very preoccupied with decorum in the synagogue and used to practicing her faith behind closed doors, but she was thrilled rather than repelled by what she saw. She described it as the beauty of holiness in the midst of desolation. And I think this episode illustrates, and here we can see what she had to say about it. She felt the honor of being distinguished by them, sitting near the ark, continuing to hold that wax taper to the Chachamim. The whole might truly be termed the rejoicings of the law. It was the beauty of holiness in the midst of desolation. It was Shavuot, I think. I think this episode shows us how a couple which was absolutely English, if we think about their dress and the social circles in which they mixed, or the aspirations to gentility which were apparent in their house in Ramsgate, was both accepting of and accepted by a kind of more traditional, observant Jewish society in other parts of the world. Well, not more observant, just more, quote, traditional. Partly this reflected the power imbalance. Jews in Eastern Europe and Palestine had to accept the Montefiores as they were, beardless, westernized, dripping in diamonds, because they needed what the Montefiores represented, wealth and political influence. But I think the timing of all this was also a critical factor. Born in the 18th century, Sir Moses had one foot in the Jewish world of his childhood, even as he placed another foot in the British establishment. It was this, the world of his childhood in the Western Sephardic diaspora, which vanished in his lifetime. Lacking this context and these connections, subsequent generations of British Jews mostly couldn't bridge these two societies in the same way. Thank you. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to take them.
I have a question.
Great.
Abigail, first of all, bravo. This was so inspiring and enriching. You've really opened a window to something that I think for most of us has been very narrow and basically unknown, how profound his area of activity and influence was. But what I find most inspiring is how you merged the story of Judith into all of his actions and pursuits. These were movers and shakers, and I don't think we have an understanding of how widespread and influential this individual was. My question is, I'm assuming he didn't act in isolation. Who were his guides and his mentors? Was there any affiliation with one of the big, scholars of the time? Someone who is so well endowed as he is, both financially, could have anybody at his doorstep. But I'm kind of wondering, who would have been his inspiration? Who would have been his guide, Jewishly speaking?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, by the way. So it's not clear that he had... I couldn't tell you who his inspirations were within Jewish tradition, but his secretary was a man called Louis Levy, who was a student of the Khatam Sofer. So the Khatam Sofer was the leading figure in Eastern European Orthodoxy. And Levy had studied with the Khatam Sofer, so he came from this very traditional rabbinical training, but he was also an amazing linguist who apparently could communicate in about 36 different languages. Obviously, we don't know how well he could communicate with them. And it does seem to be that Levy operated as the kind of translator, I suppose, and both of the Jewish tradition for him. So sometimes when Judith talks about their trip to Palestine in 1839, we see kind of Levy expounding from Jewish teachings on the religious significance of different places that they visited. So I think that some of his agenda clearly came from Levy, and probably increasingly in later life. So I would say that this was the most influential figure, really, and it was also Lurvy who was helping to publicize his activities through, for example, the Hebrew language press in the 1860s and 70s. So there's that. But I think we have to understand that this was there's a broader context in which Western European Jews, particularly in Britain and France, Adolphe Crémieux and Montefiore and Philipson in Germany are kind of engaging broadly in international philanthropic activities. So you have the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which is obviously an international association which aims to bring support to Jews in distress, but also promote the cause of emancipation in different parts of the world. And you have the Jewish press, which is very important for fundraising and sharing ideas. So I think it's the combination of these two things. So he has his, he's in a position to do things and he is pursuing his own agenda clearly. But at the same time, he's operating in a context in which people are talking about these kinds of issues. And he's not the only person. I mean, Crémieux also goes not just to Alexandria, but to Istanbul and Bucharest. So there are other people doing this as well.
I have a question, Abigail.
Hi.
First of all, what a fascinating lecture. It was really amazing to listen to. It was fun and energetic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're in Israel right now, right?
No, I'm in Britain.
Britain, okay, close enough. At the same time that Montefiore was, doing his activities, there was another big figure, Baron Hirsch.
Yes.
Did they work together? Were they coordinated? Because the Baron Hirsch also he was quite aggressive with his ideas of resettlement, right?
Yeah, so Baron Hirsch is operating a bit later after Sir Moses. In fact, he really becomes active with the JCA, this charity he founds, after the expulsion of the Jews from Moscow in 1890-91. So he's just slightly later. Contemporaries connect them. So Sir Moses was often described as the fourth Moses. You have obviously Moses, Maimonides, Mendelssohn, and Montefiore, and Hirsch actually was also a Moses, so he got to be the fifth. So contemporaries did understand them as operating within the same framework, but Hirsch was not a religious Jew. So his whole everything really about how he approached these questions was completely different.
Okay, and another question: how did how this world, like all these princesses and sultans, I mean, is a Jew that coming to talk with them, and how does it get this kind of power and influence and getting results? Because how is it different from the people that are being discriminated and treated, like second-rate citizens?
Well, he always came with the support of the local British ambassador, and that obviously did make a difference. Sometimes he went further than the British government would have wished him to do. So when he went to Morocco, the British ambassador to Morocco was completely appalled by this idea that he planned to travel to Marrakesh and try and obtain a document of some kind from the Sultan of Morocco. This was not at all in Hay's agenda for his visit. So he pushed the boundaries, but he did have the support of the British, and that was very important. I think the Rothschild connection was also important. And obviously in Morocco, in fact, his nephew and heir came from a Moroccan Jewish family, so there were other kinds of contexts. But I think sometimes people engaged with him as a kind of Tujar Sultan or a kind of Jewish or a court Jew, a Jewish financier in that way, and sometimes people engage with him because of the support of the British diplomats, but I think it was mostly the fact that he was British, which meant that he also didn't obviously present. So when he went to places like Vilna and the Pale of Settlement, he clearly didn't present like a traditional European Jew. And everybody commented on the diamonds which Judith wore when she went to the ball, where it was attended by, you know, all the grand and good in Vilna. And, you know, I'm not sure that people necessarily, you know, they were a bit shocked to see that Sir Moses didn't have a beard, because they couldn't really envisage an Orthodox Jew who didn't have a beard. So there were those kinds of differences as well. And people were always reinterpreting his agenda in ways which made more sense to the worlds in which they lived.
Okay, thank you very much.
I mean, he also had a close relationship with Queen Victoria, right?
Well, that's part of the myth, but I wouldn't say that he had a very close relation. I mean, so she did supposedly walk in his garden in Eastcliff Lodge, and I think there is the key he gave her is still in the royal collection. But I have to say, I did go and look at her diary from those, and I saw no evidence that she actually used it. I mean, because she used to say things like, I went for a walk on the pier, but she never said, I went for a walk in Sir Moses' garden. So so I'm not sure how close that relationship was. She wasn't supportive of the idea that he might become a peer, a lord. So there were limits, but when she knighted him, she said she was happy to, you know, she was pleased to knight him, you know, a good man I know, and I thought it quite right. But in the Jewish world, I think this idea that they were friends became important, and all kinds of stories emerged about, you know, how that operated. In particular, she was supposed to have given, no, he was supposed to have given her advice on how she could have give birth to her son on a ship in a way which would render him British. I always thought that was very, you know, it's a curious story which was quite widely disseminated.
And one other thing is, I mean, you know, his legacy today. I mean, there's still the Montefiore Endowment that has a fund and still funds.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I guess he created Mishkanot Shananim. So there's a kind of tangible legacy in Jerusalem. And the Montefiore Endowment, obviously it looks after the buildings in Ramsgate. It's now based in London, and it supports various kinds of smicha. They have a fellowship program in Israel, and various kinds of training programs for rabbinical training, but also lay people, in an attempt to, I suppose, kind of spread the Montefiore ethos in his memory. But I must say that I'm not sure that I think he was mostly preoccupied actually with having people to pray for him and Judith. I mean, I think it was quite and to remember them. I think it was a very traditional establishment fundamentally, despite the fact that it looks so English.
Well, thank you very much.
No children, so there was no one to say prayers for them.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I felt appreciated.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Abigail.
All the best. Hanukkah Sameach to everybody.
Hag Sameach to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hag Sameach.
Hag Sameach. Hanukkah Sameach. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hag Sameach.
Thank you.